Hi, and welcome to Alta Live. I am delighted to welcome you all to the digital event series we do here at Alta Journal. My name is Beth Spotswood. I am Alta's digital editor. And today I am so excited to welcome writer and Alta contributor Andrew Dubbins. He is the author of Into Enemy Waters, a World War II story of the demolition divers who became the Navy SEALs. So exciting. This new book is fascinating. And we got a fabulous kind of deep dive, as it were, into this in the Alta Weekend Read. Andrew wrote a special piece for Alta. You can read it online. You can subscribe to our Weekend Read newsletter. It was edited here by Matt Haber, Alta's newsletter editor. And we are so excited to welcome them both today for a discussion on these Santa Monica lifeguards who became the kind of original part of the Navy SEALs. So I'm so excited for this discussion. Before we begin, if you're unfamiliar with Alta, we are an award-winning quarterly journal focused on California and the West. If you like what we do here today, I so hope you will check out our website where you can find amazing work, including Andrew's piece, a number of pieces by Matt. As well as we host a California book club. In fact, next week, we welcome Luis J. Rodriguez as our guest. If you're interested in all in what we do and want to support work like this, you can subscribe to Alta Journal as a member for as little as $3 a month for a digital subscription. We're going to send you links to all of that, as well as Andrew's article for Alta's newsletter, Alta Online, a link to where you can buy his book. He wrote a fabulous and fascinating article online piece for us about when the mafia came to Lodi. We're going to shoot you that as well, and anything else that pops up today. So keep an eye on your email later this afternoon. If you've got questions, please use the Q&A button underneath our little video screens here. Andrew and Matt are going to speak for about 30 minutes, and then we will get to as many of your questions as we can. So I like to kick things off before I get lost and turn it over to Matt. I like to ask where everyone is zooming in from today. You can pop it in the chat. I am in Novato, California. Matt and Andrew, I'm going to get lost. Will you please let us know where you are today as well, and break a leg. Thanks, Don.
Thanks, Beth. Andrew, thank you for being here. I am in Oakland. Where are you right now?
I am in Los Angeles, my hometown.
And that's fitting because so much of the story takes place, at least the beginning part, in Los Angeles. So let's just do a quick summary of the story for the folks who haven't read it. And then we'll get into kind of how you came to tell the story and some other stuff. So tell us about the Frogmen.
Sure. So it's the story of the ocean lifeguards in Santa Monica who are working the beaches and knowledgeable about ocean safety and great swimmers using swim fins and dive masks before they were in wide usage. And World War II was looming, and Wild Bill Donovan, founder of a
great name,
OSS, yeah, he wanted to start a maritime unit for secret deployments overseas, and rounded up some of these Santa Monica lifeguards, and they became part of this special forces group that today we know as the Navy SEALs.
I think you're underselling what a ragtag bunch of kind of beach bums these guys were. I mean, yes, they were lifeguards. They were important parts of the city of Santa Monica and other parts of California, but these were just like saltwater soaked surfer dudes, right?
They loved the ocean, you know, and LA isn't always thought of as a beach town, but, you know, there are people who just love diving for lobsters, and, you know, it's an interesting waterman community. You know, I can call them beach rats, watermen, surfers, hang out.
And they kind of invented some of this stuff, right? I mean, they were like, you in an earlier draft of the piece, which unfortunately we didn't get too deep into, you talk about the history of the beaches and the culture there. Maybe you want to talk a little bit about that now.
Yeah, it's hard cutting all that because it's fascinating. I mean, early 1900s, it was a lot of indoor swimming pools, saltwater plunges, and volunteer lifeguards. You know, Abbott Kinney, who was a big real estate developer in Venice and now famous streets named after him, he hired a little troop of ocean lifeguards to help advertise his properties, and grew from there. And, 1920s, people are coming to the beach, a lot of celebrities. You got the bootleggers and under Prohibition. And then the 30s, it was a great job to be a lifeguard. And, you got that consistent government check. And people are still coming to the beach. It's free entertainment days before TV. So those are those old photos you see of just can't even see the sand, all beach umbrellas down the beach. And
in a lot of ways, it became kind of the image of California to people living back east or in the Midwest. I mean, just these beaches with, bodybuilders and surfers, and these guys were at the vanguard of that, right?
Right. And it became kind of LA's culture. They called the lifeguard the bronze savage, and a little bit sliding of Victorian morals. And it's a little looser, more casual, and it's a culture we still embrace today.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of they're kind of the birth of a whole new type of person, like a more outdoors, more natural, quote unquote, person.
Right. And yeah, the lifeguards were right at the helm of that. And we had a lot of great color in there. The beach volleyball scene all grew up on Santa Monica Beach, some of the world's
the intersection with Hollywood. You talk about how they were used as extras in films and consulted on movies and dated movie stars. They were already glamorous.
Right. And a lot of it revolved around Marion Davies' big beach estate there, which, William Randolph Hearst had bought for big costume parties, and can still go to her guest house. The mansion's long since gone, but the Annenberg House open to the public now.
So you're a pretty young guy. I don't think you remember this from your own childhood. How did you discover this story?
So it begins at the National World War II Museum in New Orleans, which is a fantastic museum. Anyone who's interested in World War II history, I recommend it. And, you could spend days in there. I didn't have days. I'm, kind of buzzing through their Pacific theater exhibits, and it's a lot of guns and ammunition and bullets. And I see a swim fin toward the end. And it was just such a shocking, low-tech piece of equipment. Had to read the caption. And it was the only mention of the underwater demolition teams of World War II. And I believe that fin was one of the first frogmen into Japan. So I scribble it down and think, this is neat. I've never heard of this. I'm a student of World War II, love reading about it, and did not know that there were guys in swim trunks, swim fins, and masks who were scouting the beaches before our troops landed. A couple years later, when I came time, I wanted to write a book, and somebody wisely told me, pick a subject that you're going to want to immerse yourself in for 2 years, and looked at my list, and I thought, this is the topic I really want to get into. So I started reading everything I could find on the underwater demolition teams and World War II frogmen.
And when you say everything you could find, were these books, or these were like books, historical documents?
Yeah, so it was all kept secret during the war. There were a couple good histories of the UDT, but not specific to World War II. Took it up to Korea and Vietnam and the founding of the SEALs. It was usually in the context of the founding of the SEALs, but not much had really been written on the World War II frogmen. So I read all the books that have been written, a lot of oral histories, a lot of obituaries, sadly, are the only recent news articles. And that's where I found the Santa Monica lifeguard connection. It was an obituary that I read, local Santa Monica frogmen who founded Junior Lifeguards. I mentioned that in my story, that I'd participated in a kid, and I thought that's pretty neat. And this story also has this OSS connection, which is fascinating. Early CIA guys.
Yeah, I was interested to see that this was conceived as part of the OSS. It's kind of not what you would expect, right? That they were part of almost a spy agency, a nascent spy agency.
Yeah, and the more you read about the OSS in World War II, that they were really into some interesting things. I did some reporting on Catalina, and I was over there. That's where the secret frogman base was. And there were a lot of servicemen on Catalina during the war. Nobody knew about the OSS training base there. But in talking to people, I found out this episode, which is incredible, that, you know, we looked to some Korean prisoners of war who we captured. They're wearing Japanese uniforms, and they were eager to drive the Japanese out of Korea, and made some fake passports for him, got him out of the prison camp. I mean, it's just right out of the old adventure movies.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I referenced the Dirty Dozen. That was an OSS, you know, fictional op, and they were into some courageous actions in World War II.
Yeah. Let's talk about a character in the story who's like, I think, so compelling. This guy, Dr. Jack Taylor. Tell us about him.
Yeah, fascinating. A Hollywood dentist.
Like literally a dentist to the stars.
A dentist to the stars, yeah, and you know, very successful practice, but just bored fixing teeth every day, and would go on these high octane weekend adventures up to Alaska gold mining and taking his sailboat across the Pacific, and founded the Santa Monica Yacht Club, which I think is so cool. He's still on the, you know, the roster of the founding member, and got in with Wild Bill Donovan. They roamed in similar social situations and
tough guy circles.
Yeah, and he, you know, was an early officer in this maritime unit. Went off a different direction than the local lifeguards over to the European theater, and then just you know, adventures with Hollywood celebrity Sterling Hayden in Italy, and you know, working in Egypt, and then tragically captured by the Gestapo and put in a concentration camp, suffered PTSD and died not long after the war. So incredible tale. For people who want to know more about him, mine was more of an ensemble piece, but book called First Seal is really excellent, and the first telling of his story by Patrick O'Donnell. So great stuff on him.
This gives me a natural segue to ask about the connection between the Frogmen and the SEALs, and kind of how maybe the earlier group influenced what we know today. What's the connection between these groups?
Yeah, so the SEALs drew from a lot of places, including the OSS, including the underwater demolition teams, and there's some overlap there in that the OSS men who deployed to the Pacific, it was as part of underwater demolition teams. My book is on the underwater demolition teams, and you know, the overlaps are, a couple Navy SEALs have read the book and commented on, you know, these are the same tactics we practice today. That's stealth swimming, underwater demolition, secret deployments, the same as the UDT Frogmen.
Crazy endurance too, right? You talk about swimming to Catalina Island, which how
Right.
many miles is that?
Yeah, and in fact, you know, in Fort Pierce, Florida, which today houses the National Navy SEAL Museum, that's where Hell Week began in World War II. The SEALs still call it that. It was a grueling first week of conditioning to kind of sort the men from the boys. And you know, SEALs selection process is obviously more rigorous today, but they were doing it back then too.
Well, it seems that also both groups drew from kind of somewhat anti-authority, kind of wild men who were brought in and trained, and their wildness was harnessed for the purposes for the military. But they all seem like they're somewhat anti-authority, kind of wild men.
Definitely true of some of these characters you come across in the OSS. You know, in the underwater demolition teams, which is the focus of my book, you also had really young kids because they had to just be in this amazing shape to carry packs of explosives on their back through the water and to be able to blow up beach obstacles. I mean, that's hard terrain and soft sand and climbing mountains. So they didn't want anyone older than 35. So it's young guys who are almost, I mean, just, they didn't know the risk they were taking to think about it, deploy unarmed. All they had was a knife for cutting their fuses and detonating cord, swimming up to enemy beaches, and a little training in hand-to-hand combat, but it was heroic, and you know, much younger even than me. And what
were some of the challenges for you bringing some of this history to life? Some of the descriptions in the story just felt so vivid and like you were there. Obviously you were not. How do you do that? How do you find those details?
It is a challenge. And, you know, when you have a living source, that's ideal because you can ask the operative questions.
But we're 75 plus years out here. So.
Right. Yeah. And, you know, when you have somebody who experienced it, you can ask them, how do you feel? What were you thinking? You don't have that, you know, when they've all passed away, sadly. So you're looking at, you know, using the same techniques as a historian, David McCullough, trying to get oral histories and letters and pictures to help you recreate some of the color. And it does allow for some, you know, creativity. You got to think about structure. I don't have enough on them, so I'm gonna tease them here and bring them up in another section. So there's some strategy with the constraints too. But it's difficult. And I will say, when you do find a piece of material on one of these guys who's long forgotten, like the son of one of the frogmen I talked to for the story, he just said, you know, my dad filled out this questionnaire if you want to check that. I was like, please send it. And it was so fun for me to read, just seeing, you know, talking about the Catalina base. And, you know, it's also kind of sad because it was after the war, big, long questionnaire. He put a lot of effort into the first few questions and then didn't answer the rest, probably thought, nobody cares. And I'm glad that I got to come along 70 years later and discover it and bring his story to life.
But people obviously do still care. I mean, you know, World War II is a perennial topic of interest for people and historians and filmmakers. Tell me about a little bit of your personal connection to this. You, at the very end, you appear as a character in the story, which everyone should read all the way to the end. Tell me about what draws you to this material so closely. You obviously have been thinking about World War II way before the book, way before this article.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I think it started with my grandpa. He was a Navy pilot up in the Aleutians, which is another kind of forgotten tale of World War II. He was flying PBY Catalinas, the big flying boats, and said we lost, you know, more men to the weather than to the Japanese who were up there on American soil. And I never really got to hear his stories. He passed away about 8 days after I was born. And so it all came from my mom, and gave me an appreciation that there's really a timestamp on these stories, you know. And I also built model airplanes. My neighbor was on the USS Missouri, which I got to write about in my book, which is fun to recreate. So just developed an interest as a kid and have been reading and watching about it ever since. And then when I came across this Frogman world, growing up in Santa Monica and Santa Monica Beach and junior lifeguards, I naturally gravitated and loved that.
So as you're doing your research, are you like taking notes for future ideas and future books that are either overlooked or underwritten about stories?
Perhaps, although when you get to the end of a World War II project, sometimes your head just wants to go somewhere else entirely. But there are still some great untold tales of World War II, and I still feel that, you know, the clock is ticking on these stories. And you know, it's one piece that I would like to write is about these people who've been collecting oral histories. We owe them such a thank you over the past few decades, and kind of amateur historians, and they're wonderful archives of oral histories from the World War II veterans, whether it's the National World War II Museum or the Library of Congress. And
are there online resources that you want to shout out that we can link to? I mean, we can add these later, but are there any that were particularly useful to you?
Those two were very useful. World War II Museum. I had a chance to visit this small, it's not small, it's this incredible Museum of the Pacific in Fredericksburg, which is about an hour drive from Austin. And somebody had described it to me as like a Smithsonian in the middle of small town Texas. And that was exactly it. Just state-of-the-art immersive exhibits. And
who funds that thing? Wow.
It was affiliated with the Smithsonian, and it started in Fredericksburg because that was the birthplace of Admiral Chester Nimitz, who's in my book. And obviously a legendary figure of World War II. And he said, I don't want a museum dedicated to me. They did build the first building in his house. He said, it's got to be about the guys of the Pacific Theater. So that incredible archives, they've been collecting oral histories going back to Nimitz and just all these old Texas volunteers running around Texas and talking to World War II veterans. So such a service, and we have that archive now.
One thing I enjoyed about your piece also was you mentioned some of the big well-known heroes, but your piece focused on unheralded people. And there's that great little vignette where MacArthur is staging this photo and your guys kind of interact with history, but they're coming at it from a different angle. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about that moment. Yeah,
that was pretty neat, and I'm glad to be able to include that. So it actually wasn't a Santa Monica lifeguard, but a lifeguard turned OSS man, and he's walking on the beach at Leyte
in Philippines
with his buddies, and he's probably teenager, early 20s, and sees a guy wading ashore in wet khakis, people shooting photos of him, and they didn't know who it was. And a major comes up, why didn't you salute? And they said, why? Found out later it's General MacArthur, and it's part of the publicity stunt, which people see that picture and think, oh, he's coming ashore.
Right.
He's the first one there. They don't
the hero returns.
Frogmen have been working those beaches for, these young guys. And so I do love the stories of kind of the guys on the periphery of history. And that's the story that the UDT, they were, the Seabees is another unit, just building the runways and scouting the beaches. They weren't celebrated, and it wasn't glamorous, and it was integral to the war effort.
But that's what a piece like yours does, is it finds these people who maybe were there and were important, but their names are not remembered by everybody and not celebrated in PBS documentaries and whatever. And to bring them to life and to tell their story is kind of a rare opportunity, I would imagine, for a writer.
I love to do it. I seek it out, kind of the peripheral characters of history. And the neatest thing is because they don't think they're heroes. They don't think the story's any more special. And I see these and I'm like, are you kidding? The lifeguard turned frogman? And when they see it laid out, the reaction has been really positive. And some family members of frogmen, it's been neat having some family members reach out and say, I'm into the South Pacific, and I always knew he was a hero, but it's not much out there on them. And so I'm privileged to be able to tell these tales.
Are there any other characters in the book that are somewhat similar, like that didn't get their due and that you had a chance to write through for them?
I picked out a lot of scenes in the book with that in mind. Like I wanted to show on these big events through the eyes of, the dripping wet teenagers in swim trunks. And, I found an oral history of a guy who said, I was on, watching the atom bomb being loaded into the Enola Gay. Wow. As a UDT officer. And I thought that's got to be in there. We haven't seen the Frogman young perspective on that. You hear about Tibbets. And so I tried to tell the story through some unsung heroes' perspectives.
Awesome. Well, I think that for this one, it really came through. I mean, the care that you took with their individual stories and getting those details, it just brought them to life for a new readership. So thank you for that.
Thank you. And I had a great editor in Matt.
Oh, well, thank you. I think we'll bring Beth back and have the questions. But thank you so much for this. And Beth, take it away.
This is fascinating. First question. Do you think this would ever become a movie? This seems so Hollywood perfect.
Are you there, Netflix? Are you there?
Yeah.
Are you watching Netflix or Apple Plus?
If anyone wants to, let me know. I do. I narrative nonfiction, which I love, often lends itself well to film or TV telling. And, it's just a matter of finding the right passionate person who's going to invest the time and money to.
George Clooney as Dr. Jack Taylor.
Well, it also really just lends itself. We've got the very attractive lifeguards, beaches, war, demolition. I mean,
It's
the
Magic Mike
summer,
goes to World War II.
right?
Somebody did tell me like it's Baywatch meets, I forget
Right.
what they said, Saving Private.
Band of Brothers.
All
Right.
right.
There you go.
Can you, Andrew, describe or maybe just clarify the trajectory of this special unit in World War II to the Navy SEALs that we think of today, the SEAL Team 6, for example? How did they go from the beach rats of Santa Monica to what we now think of as Navy SEALs?
So, the Navy SEALs started in the 60s under President Kennedy, wanted unconventional warfare capabilities, and their first major deployments were in Vietnam. Drew a lot of tactics from these special operations units of World War II. And that includes these OSS guys who some people say are really the original Frogmen because they had the offensive capabilities. The UDT were a defensive unit. They were scouting the beaches, but these OSS Frogmen, they were training with, waterproof machine guns and also using early scuba equipment, which is such an interesting part of this story. Some of the first guys using scuba in the ocean, which of course the SEALs now integrate into their training. So a lot of they drew from a lot of these units. Underwater demolition teams and the OSS maritime unit are two of the big ones
that essentially set the groundwork, the foundation for the 1960s official Navy SEALs unit that we now know today.
Yeah. And a lot of their training was codified into manuals. A lot of their combat experiences, as you read about the underwater demolition teams in World War II, they started at Kwajalein, a little atoll, just with a couple officers who took off their fatigues and were wearing swim trunks underneath. Those were really some of the first frogmen. By the end of the war, Okinawa, you had 1,000 swimmers swimming in to scout the beaches, and it was working like clockwork. They had big warships firing over their heads. And so it got down to a science. And, at Okinawa, the Japanese weren't even opposing us. We landed unopposed. So they really mastered this. All of that went into these huge manuals at the end of the war. And those were integral in shaping some of the tactics and techniques that the Navy SEALs use.
Before we run out of time, one more question. Are there other books or stories of untold war heroes that Andrew recommends or looked to as a reference while he was writing?
Oh, well, as a reference, I mentioned First SEALs. I would check that out if you're interested in this OSS maritime unit. Ones I personally love are, Eric Larson, Garden Beasts, and Boys in the Boats. There's a lot of great kind of war adjacent unsung heroes. Louis Zamperini's story in Unbroken is one of my favorites. Any kind of narrative nonfiction, maybe not about the generals and the troop movements, but about a character. And there's some great pieces out there like that.
Of those, I've read Unbroken. That was made into a movie, though. I feel like not nearly as good as the book. Hopefully, if they turn your book into a movie, it'll be equally as fantastic. With that, I'm so grateful to you, Andrew Dubbins, and of course, my wonderful colleague, Matt Haber. Before you all go, wait, I'd like to invite you to next week's Alta Live. We're going to welcome San Francisco writer and legend Gary Camilla, who's going to talk about Diego Rivera and Frida Kahlo's time in San Francisco, the work that they created for and from San Francisco, and kind of their experience and scandals and life while up here in the Bay Area. So please join us for that. That is June 20th at 12:30 here at Alta Live. Again, we're going to send you links to Andrew's book. I put it in the chat also. His article for Alta's newsletter, a link to how to sign up for our array of newsletters, including the weekend read, which is fantastic and a fun Saturday read for you every Saturday, obviously. and a recording to this interview if you missed any part of it or want to share it with all your World War II aficionados. Thank you both so much.
Thank you.
Likewise, thank you.
And we'll see you next week, everyone. Take care.